This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Any questions, guys, from the session we had on Friday? Any questions that I can take? So we are talking about virtual networks. We're talking about a little bit of, let's say, the storage integration. We'll complete that cycle today. So any questions that I can take? Anyone? Any questions that I can take till here? So why are you sitting so far? You can come a little friend. The chair is comfortable. Okay, cool. Yes. Any questions? Anyone? Any questions?
Hi, Kiran.
So good, please.
Yeah, Kiran, in industry also we need to do with portal only, or there will be another tool for this in industry.
For virtual networks, you mean?
Yeah, for the Azure
You can.
DevOps,
Mhm.
Azure DevOps work. So in real time industry also they will be following this Microsoft Azure no portal and doing the things, or they
Uh,
will be
Again,
installing separate software.
no, again, it depends upon, to elaborate a little bit on the question. When you say Azure DevOps and Azure, two different things out here again. DevOps is
Okay,
a separate individual portal. Azure is a separate individual portal. We haven't gone into DevOps yet. We are
okay,
in Azure only. So Azure itself is, let's say, a technology in itself. So yes, when you are into a role of Azure, then you would be using portal only. And on the portal,
okay,
you can create it manually using PowerShell, ARM, Terraform, a lot of things out there. So programmatically, you can create all these things, or you can manually create all these things out here.
okay, okay.
Yes. Any more questions here? All right. So let's go ahead and start the creation of a storage account, and let me mute people. Great. All right. So let's go ahead and start with the creation of virtual networks. Again, for a virtual network, you will need a tenant. We have a tenant subscription. We have a subscription resource group. We don't have a resource group. So I'll create a resource group, and then we can go and create a, let's say, a virtual network out here. Or while you're creating the virtual network, you can create a resource group. Any which ways, it's fine. So I'll say virtual networks. I do not have a virtual network, and I'll say create. And I will say new. I'll say this is VNet RG, and I'll say the name of the virtual network is something like demo VNet. Just giving a name to it. I'll say the location here is East US2 because I want to create my storage account in East US2 as well. IP addresses, very important. This is the page where I want to again emphasize on is that this is now a range. I'm telling how many addresses can come inside this particular range out here, and I have a space called 10.0.0.0 /16. 16 here is my subnet masking. It's called as a subnet masking, which tells how many blocks of addresses are reserved, how many blocks of addresses that you cannot use. And here I cannot use what? The first two, starting from the left hand side, the first two out here. So the calculation of it would be 2 power 32, which is the total number of bytes, because each and everything is what? 8, and this is 8 into 4, 32 out here, minus 16. That will give you 65,536 addresses. These are addresses that you can get, meaning each and every address can be associated with one particular resource, meaning I can create 65,536 storage accounts, 65,536 virtual machines inside this. That is, it is that big of a space. Now, if I don't want this big of a space, okay, let's say I go for another number called 24. How many addresses do you think will I get in 24, or what does 24 really mean out here? 2 power 8, meaning I can have, or let's say if I go for 24, then it is 10.0.0.0 forward slash 24, which means 8 into 3 is 24, which means that these three are occupied, which means that the first address can be something like 10.0.0.0. Second address can be 10.0.0.0. This 10.0.0 will always be constant, be 1 here in the last, so on to 10.0.0.0.255. Totally 0 to 255 is equal to what? 256 addresses. Meaning, even if you calculate this, it is 2 power 32 minus 24, 2 power 8. 2 power 8 is nothing but 256 out here. Or simply go into CIDR.xyz, put your address in, and then that will give you, that will itself tell you what is the number. So if you can go there, it's something known as CIDR.xyz. And if I say it is 10.0.0.0 forward slash 24, it will tell you all these three are occupied. This one has, or this block is open, and this will give you what? 256 addresses out here. If I reduce this, or if I increase this number 25, the address count is reducing 26, reducing further. So greater your subnet masking, lesser will be the amount of addresses that you get out there, and lesser your subnet masking, greater is the amount of addresses that you get out there. So then my question to Microsoft is that, you know what, my architecture or my project is very big. I cannot, let's say, go with 65,536. Can I get more addresses? Microsoft says yes, you can reduce your subnet masking. I'll say okay, fine. If I put 15, then I'm getting 131,072. If I put 14, I get something like 262,144. So the lesser is my subnet masking, the greater is the address. Inverse proportional relationship. The greater is your subnet masking, lesser is the amount of addresses out here. My question to Microsoft is that what can be the smallest number, or what can be the smallest address, or what can be the smallest subnet masking that I can go for, or what is the maximum number of addresses I can get out of this particular, let's say, CIDR address space. Microsoft says you can try it out, and I'll say 10.0.0.1. But as and when I put a 10.0.0.1, I'm getting an issue out here. Invalid number. Then who exactly controls this? What exactly controls this out? Is that very simple? See, guys, when you go to a shop and you want to buy a product, you look for the ISI mark telling that if the product is, let's say, qualified with this particular thing. And if the government of India has to issue ISI mark to a particular product, they will do some tests telling that, okay, fine, this is what is the maximum, let's say, number that you can go for and all these things. In the same way, all these addresses are shared spaces, meaning you can use this address, I can use this address, and all these things. So these are limited in nature. So there is an norm or a convention called RFC 1918 standards. Look at this, and if I go into Wikipedia, so if you look at this one, the RFC 1918 standards enforced by an organization called Internet Engineering Task Force, they say that if you are using a 10.0.0.0 address, the maximum or the largest block is what? 8. You cannot do a 7, you cannot do a 6. If I do something like 7 or 6, what is it telling me? Not a valid CIDR block because you are not following the RFC 1918 standard. If you are using a 10.0.0.0, the maximum that you can get here is 16,777,216. That's what your RFC 1918 standard tells you. 16,777,216 out here, which is used by a lot of organizations. The 10.0 address is used by a lot of organizations out here, and this is called as a class A address, a single contiguous class A address, which are costly in nature, which are a little costly in nature. Now, let's say you are an organization who doesn't want to go for class A. You can go for something known as what? Class B network addresses that start with what? 172.16.0.0, and the maximum address that you can go for here is what? /12, which is somewhere around 1048,576 addresses out here. So if I take this out, I did not copy this properly, but let me go ahead here. And if I say 172.16.0.0, I cannot do a /8 here. Not a valid address block, because the minimum that I can go for here is what? 12. It is what? 1048,576. Class B. Finally, you have something called what? Class C, which is 192.168.0.0. Now, this is the address which is very famous when you buy a router. When you first buy a router, right? If you want to configure a router, you'll go to 192.168.0.1 or 0.2 and then configure the router out here. Private IP addresses for the routers that you buy, a little cheaper, but the maximum that you can go for here is what? /16, which is going to give you what? 65,536 addresses out here. So what I'll do, I'll come back to the class A, 10.0.0.0 We'll stick with /16 out here, and I am telling Azure that I want this big of an address. So my virtual network will give me an isolation. So this is my own private space with around 65,536 addresses out here. Addresses out here. Now, very simple, guys. It's just like you buying in a physical world. If I have to compare it, it's just like you going ahead buying a land and putting a fence around it. Very simple. It's like telling that this is your property or this is your own private property out here and all these things. Now, my question is that you bought a land, you put a fence around it. Can you start living inside it? Can you start living? Meaning just on the land directly? You need something else. You need to build a house. You need rooms in that particular house. Same way, if you create a virtual network, you cannot use it directly. Even in Microsoft Azure, when you create a virtual network, you cannot use it directly. You need to have rooms inside that particular virtual network. Very simple. Those rooms are called as subnets, subnetworks. Very simple. This will tell you how, or this subnet we will give you the actual usable space. This is what a subnet will actually go ahead and give you out here. How do I create a subnet? If I come back, if I just scroll down, sorry, if I just scroll down, there is something called add a subnet. I'll say add a subnet, and I can say this is subnet 1. And now it's telling me what is the address range of your subnet. Meaning you have bought a virtual network of 10.0.0.0/16. Now tell me what is the space that you want for your subnet, meaning for individual rooms, what is the space that you want? Do you want a smaller room, do you want a bigger room, and all that stuff, right? Now very importantly, the subnet address range should be contained within the virtual network address space. What do I mean by that? If your virtual network is 10.0.0.0/16, your subnet cannot be 10.0.0.0/15, because subnet will become bigger than your virtual network, meaning your room is becoming bigger than your house. Cannot be possible. Your subnet address range can be less than or equal to your virtual network address range out here. So if I do 10.0.0.0/16, this is fine, meaning I just have a house with one room inside it, which is not ideal, but you can have something like that. And your subnet will occupy, one subnet will occupy the entire virtual network address space. Again, a subnet is also represented by the same thing. So you'll have one subnet out here. Now, usually we do not go for one subnet. Usually in an architecture, we do not go for really one subnet out here. We divide the virtual networks so that this particular subnet can hold one type of resource like storage account, and you can apply one kind of, let's say, security on this particular, let's say, subnet. You can have another subnet which will hold one type of resource called virtual machine, and you can apply a different policy on that. So for security reasons, we normally divide our subnet, and what I'll do is I'll give an address space of 10.0.0.0/24 to my subnet. /24, this will give me what? 256 IPs, which is starting from 10.0.0.0 all the way going till what? 10.0.0.0.255. So this subnet 1, has a range. If you look at this, do you see the range here? 10.0.0.0 to what? 10.0.0.255. I'll say add. I have one subnet out here. I can go for one more subnet. I'll say subnet 2, and I'll try to give the same thing. I'll say 10.0.0.0/24. What is the error that I'm getting? It's already done, meaning I've already taken the subnet. So now it's telling the subnet prefix overlaps with what? 10.0.0. Then what can be the address range that I can now give? 25. Say 25. Again overlaps.
Lesser,
Because
lesser.
25, 23
1 by 24.
already taken. Because see, 10.0.0.0 is already taken. If I say 23, 24 also comes under 23.
Between
If I
two
say
power
25,
something.
I'm
16.
sorry, 1. So I'll say 1. Cannot be possible because this needs to change. This has to be 0. Can I do a 1 here? 10.1. Can I do that? Why does it giving me an
First
error here?
three numbers is constant, no?
Exactly. Virtual network, the second number is constant, but the third number isn't. Can I change this one? This can be an address inside the same virtual network. Now, do you see what is the address range of this particular subnet? 10.0.1.0 to what? 10.0.1.255. Meaning I can have the address starting from 10.0.1.0, 10.0.1.1, 10.0.1.2, 10.0.1.3, and so on and so forth, which will again give me 0 to 255, 256 addresses. So I am dividing my subnet so that each and every subnet has 256 addresses out here. In this way, I can go for subnet 1 to subnet 256 because each and every subnet is giving me 256. 256 into 256 will again become what? 65,536 out here. So if I go for a last subnet, I can say subnet 255, and I can say 10.0.255.0/24. I can have this combination as well. So it just depends upon how you're dividing the subnet out, how you're, let's say, occupying the subnet out, and etc. Now, one more thing is that now a fact is that I cannot go for a subnet whose address space, let's say this is 2.0, it's less than 15 or less than 16. I cannot do this. Neither I can go for 16 out here because already I have occupied a lot of things, so I cannot do that. So it is established now that my subnet address space should be greater than or equal to 16 out here. But what is the smallest subnet that I can have? Can I do 32?
8.
Why can't I do 32? Less
So
than or
due to
equal to what? 29, meaning I cannot have an address which is less than /29. Why is it so? Is because there is something known as address reservation by Azure. Not only Azure, any cloud provider does something called address reservation, meaning if you go for a subnet called 10.0.0.0/24, this will give you how many? 256 IPs minus 5. It's always minus 5, which is equal to 251 usable IPs. Look at this, that's what it will tell you. It is, in this case, it is 10.0.2.0 / 29 is nothing but 2 power 3. 32 minus 29 is 2 power 3, which is 8. 8 minus 5 or 3 plus 5 is 5 Azure reserved addresses. Why do they reserve? Is because of multiple reasons, something known as communication broadcasting. Future purposes, meaning in the future Microsoft wants to roll out an update, they need a subnet out here. Any cloud provider does this. GCP, Microsoft, Azure, anyone goes ahead, does that particular reservation out here. So I cannot have a 2 power, or I cannot have, let's say, something like 30, because 2 power 2 4, 4 minus 5 is minus 1. I cannot have a minus 1 address out there. So the least subnet is a 29. Because of these factors, the least subnet is a 29. And now I have a virtual network with 4 different subnets, and I can say review and create this out. Go ahead, please. You will need at least one subnet to create your virtual network. But after creating a virtual network, you can also add your subnets. Now I have 4. I can add a fifth one, sixth one, seventh one, etc. But to start with, you need at least one subnet to create a virtual network out there. You cannot create a blank virtual network out there. That is not possible. But you can create a virtual network with one subnet, later add multiple subnets out there. Should not be an issue. So I'll go ahead, create this out, and have a virtual network created in the first place out there. So I'm creating a virtual network with 4 different subnets out here. Each and every subnet here gives me around 256 addresses barring one, which for demo I created somewhere with 8, let's say, addresses in that, out of which there are 3 usable addresses, 5 Azure reserved addresses out there. So this is what I did. I created this particular subnet out here, and I created the virtual network and the subnet inside it. If I go into the virtual network, I have things like what is the address space, and if I go into something called subnets, I have these 4 subnets that are giving me what, 251 IPs each, but the last one is giving me around, let's say, 3 IPs, because I went ahead and added this for, let's say, my demo purpose out here and etc. Any questions still here that I can take? Anyone? Any questions with the VNet and the subnet creation out here? So now I created a VNet, I created a subnet. I now want to create a storage account and place it under one of the subnets out here. Integrate it under one of the subnets so that as a user or as an organization, I can ensure the security of this particular storage account. Meaning, as you as a user should not be able to access it over the internet. This is what I am now telling. Is you as a user should go through my virtual network in order to access this particular storage account. And on top of this particular virtual network, I can implement something known as firewall. I can filter my traffic. I can do a lot of things out here. So let's do that. I'll create a storage account resource. I'll say create this out. And while creation, I'll say this is, let's say, some resource group like storage RG. Say okay. I'll say this is demo storage vnet abc000, something like this, so that the name can be unique. ECUS2 standard. I'll say this is LRS to begin with. I'll say advanced. In advanced, we went ahead and just said whether it is hot or cool. I'll put it in hot. Very importantly, here I have a networking tab wherein I can say don't enable sorry, don't enable access from all the networks, but use a virtual network or an IP address out here. I'll just scroll down and I can pick up the virtual network not only from this subscription, but if I have your virtual network in a different subscription, you can, let's say, go ahead and do that. But in my case, I have only one subscription and I have what? The virtual network. And the reason that you're able to see this is because the virtual network is also in the same region. If my storage account is in a different region, it is possible, but you will need something called as private endpoints, which we'll talk about. There is something called private endpoint connection. If your storage account is in a different region and virtual network is in a different region, you can still integrate it, but not directly. So if you look at this, if I change the region of my storage account to SCS2, I'll say networking. I'll just scroll down. There's no networks because I do not have a virtual network in that particular region called SCS2. So direct integration is not possible if the virtual network is in a different region, but using something known as private endpoints. There's something known as private endpoint. You can add a private endpoint if your virtual network is in a different region, or if your virtual network is in a different tenant also. In a different tenant in a different region, you can be using something called private endpoint connections. We'll have a separate demo for what private endpoints really are. So for now, I'll just go into, let's say, basics. I'll change that particular region back into ECS2, then go into the networking and then say that, okay, fine, this is the network that I want. And then it's telling you can choose subnet 1, 2, 3, whatever it is, or you can choose all the subnets. All these 4 subnets will have the access to that particular network. You can choose that. In my case, I'll disable this and I'll say subnet 1. And do you see what is happening here? Microsoft.storage endpoint will be added out here. Let's understand what that is. Finally, I'll say data protection. Here I can say what is a soft delete and all that stuff. I'll say review and create this out. So not only I'm creating a storage account, but I'm also, while the creation of the storage account is going on, I'm integrating that particular storage account with a virtual network. So I am not exposing my storage account to the internet traffic. I'm not just going ahead and exposing my storage account to the internet traffic out here. So you as a user over the internet cannot directly interact with my storage account like the way we used to do earlier. Like earlier, we just took the storage account, put the data, did whatever with the data and all that stuff. Now you cannot do that. Reason being, my storage account is now virtual network integrated. So let's see this. Once this is virtual network integrated, let's see what really happens out here. Let's see what do we get out here and all these things. So it's now deploying, but firstly, do you see what it's doing? It's integrating the virtual network, or it's adding something known as an endpoint called Microsoft.storage to your storage account out to your virtual network out here. We'll talk about what does this and why that is required and all these things out. And let me just do a refresh, and it's now going ahead and creating something known as a storage account. And once the storage account is created, let's look at how the storage account is and what you will get with that particular storage account and everything.